Homestead here. We've been pretty much cooped up in the camper and the solar shed for a few days. Camper's leaking everywhere, which is to be expected with a 1992 model camper. And the rain just stopped. The wind is blowing so hard that most things are pretty dry. I don't even have any wetness on my hiking boots here. So we're going to go around the property and assess the damage. We made it down to the creek. I've never seen it this deep. It's essentially overflowing the banks. This is where the cows cross on our neighbor's property from one pasture to the other. And it's actually our least obstructed access to the creek. Usually all of this is some sort of aquatic grass. It's completely covered. We have a pond here. Similar to the creek, it's overflowing its banks. We have a small walkway here to get around the pond. And the whole thing is flooding because the PVC pipe that diverts the water and controls the height of the water was clogged. You can probably hear the noise in the background. I just unclogged the pipe. Now the water's freely flowing. It's probably going to take at least a day to get this back to its managed depth. I'm over at the pear tree. There's like 100 pears on the ground. We're trying to collect the ones that don't have any deer bites or animal bites in them. And we're setting them all over here on Cedar Swing. We already have like 50 on there right now. We're probably gonna get another 50 put there before we leave this area. Similar to apples, pears have their place as a staple in American diets. You can eat them plain once they get ripe, or you can cut them up for pies or even mash them into sauce. We also have all of these chestnuts, and we're not really sure exactly what to do with them. And then there's the hickory nuts. We filled up our pockets with these, and when we got back up to our homestead site, we dumped them all into a bowl, and they're probably going to sit around until we can figure out how to actually open them up. After the hurricane passed, we got the sense that winter was starting to approach. And since we had been living at my parents' house down in South Carolina until we moved here, we still have a lot of stuff there. So even though my parents were out of town, we decided to go down to retrieve my totes full of winter clothes, which I need to be able to function comfortably outside here during the winter. But while we were there, we decided to process as many of our seasonal produce as possible. You can see here Angie is skinning and dicing the pears into pretty small pieces and then throwing them in this giant crock pot. We'll show you in a minute exactly what's going to happen with those.
Angie started this batch with apples first, and then she added all of our pear slices. The goal was to allow these to cook for at least 8 hours before adding anything else. We do have a couple extra surprises, so take a look at what Angie added next. Angie had the idea to locate a bag of frozen blackberries, and you can see here once that bag was thawed exactly what the consistency of those berries was. But there's also a bag of figs from my parents' garden. So Angie's chopping those up just to add a bit of extra flavor to this blend. As you can imagine, this is a bit of a gamble because we really don't know what all of these flavors are going to taste like together. Apples and pears are a similar flavor and a similar texture, so those ones should go together. But I can tell you, as future editing Ben, that this blend was amazing, and I wish we had a lot more of it. You can see here how Angie is stirring these together and how the color is starting to change. You'll notice that again later when it comes time to blend, that those blackberries really dominate the pigments in this sauce.
Next on our checklist is pumpkins. Angie grew these in the garden this year, and they look pretty great. You can see some of them are still a bit green, but because it got so cold, I'm pretty sure they're not really going to be developing anymore on the vine. Just to be safe, we left 2 on the vine, just to check next month. Angie put them in the oven, and then a few hours later, they turned out brown, as you see them here in this shot. The skin doesn't really matter, because the process that they need to go through involves scooping out the seeds, taking the meat of the pumpkin to preserve for later, and then discarding the skins along with the seeds. So back to the crock pot. You can see here all of those 4 ingredients cooked down
to a dark mash. It's not as bright as the pears would have been by themselves, but because of the added berries and figs, they became that dark color. Angie's processing all of that mash into a puree, which involves scooping several batches into the blender, and then we're dumping it into these empty yogurt containers to keep them refrigerated or even frozen until we need them. You might notice that we did not add any sweetener to this blend. Now that we're done with the fruit blend, let's get back to those pumpkins. They've cooled enough to handle them. I have a bowl and a large spoon to scoop out the seeds. And I also have a cutting board there, just to kind of keep the countertops clean. There were 4 pumpkins, each of them cut in half creates 8 halves. So I'm putting them back on the tray, which is getting pretty full, and you'll see by the end of this that this bowl gets completely filled up with the fibers and the seeds that were inside of the pumpkins. Basically, I remove the seeds and any of those stringy spaghetti-like fibers before I start to scoop that meat of the pumpkin out of the skin. I don't know if there's any ramifications of eating the skin, but it's definitely not as palatable and smooth when it comes to making puree. So that's why we don't save it. But I'm sure you could find some other use for the pumpkin skins, especially if you have animals to feed on your homestead, or if you're trying to break things down to form some compost. Here's a close-up of the freshly processed pumpkin halves, and now it's time to get to the fun part, which is getting the food element out of the shell of the pumpkin. Here's a close-up of the technique that Angie uses to remove that meat. You can see it's somewhat fibrous, similar to what you would find inside of a butternut squash. It peels away pretty easily from the skin, but there's a few pumpkins that were squishier, maybe overcooked, and it became a bit more difficult to remove it from the skin without puncturing the skin. You can see here some of the skin actually starts falling apart the harder you attempt to scoop against the skin. But once we have as much as we need, we're going to actually put it into the blender and puree it. If we had something immediate to bake with the pumpkin, we could certainly just leave that out. But we're going to freeze it for our trip back to Virginia.
Well, that concludes this week's video. We have several bags of frozen pumpkin puree. And we're pretty excited about that because we like to incorporate pumpkin into soups and also different desserts like cheesecake, pumpkin pie. And then we have what's essentially a fruit butter. We've been putting this on pancakes. I've also mixed it with cream cheese and yogurt. When I mix it with cream cheese, it's an excellent filling for crepes. And then with yogurt, it's just a nice healthy dessert. So if you have any interest in future homesteading recipes like this, please subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you next time here on Kind Heart Homestead. Bye.